You're standing in a garden that smells like roses and roasting meat. Laughter drifts through the evening air. Then you see them human bodies, coated in pitch, burning along the pathways like street lamps. The flames illuminate the faces of Rome's elite as they dine and drink, their conversation never pausing. This isn't punishment happening in some distant arena. This is decoration. And before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. It amazes me every single time that a story this dark, from 2,000 years ago, still finds its way to every corner of the planet. This was Rome in 64 CE, under the Emperor Nero. But here's what the history books often skip. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't madness. It was policy. Nero didn't invent Roman cruelty. He perfected it, systematized it, turned it into theater that the entire empire would learn to applaud. And he wasn't alone. Over the next century, 3 more emperors, Caligula, Domitian, and Commodus, would take that template and refine it, each adding their own signature to the empire's architecture of fear. The question historians have wrestled with for centuries isn't just what these men did, it's how Rome allowed them to do it. How does an empire built on law, reason, and civic virtue transform torture into entertainment, execution into spectacle, and paranoia into governance? The answer lies not in the madness of 4 men, but in the machinery they inherited and the system they left behind. Because when the ledger finally closes, when the marble crumbles and the chronicles fade, the bones still speak. And what they tell us is far more disturbing than any single tyrant's cruelty. Nero understood something fundamental about power that most rulers miss. Spectacle doesn't just display authority, it manufactures it. When the Great Fire of 64 CE swept through Rome, destroying 3 districts completely and damaging 7 more, Nero faced a crisis that could have ended his reign. The people were angry, homeless, and looking for someone to blame. Rumors swirled that Nero himself had started the fire to clear space for his extravagant golden house, the Domus Aureum. But Nero didn't defend himself. He redirected. Christians, a small, misunderstood sect that refused to participate in Roman religious rituals, became the perfect scapegoat. They were already distrusted. Nero simply amplified what society was primed to believe, and then he gave Rome a show they would never forget. Tacitus, writing in his annals decades later, describes the executions with clinical precision. Some victims were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were nailed to crosses, the traditional Roman punishment for slaves and rebels. But the most haunting detail, the one that reveals Nero's genius for psychological warfare, was the human torches. Prisoners were coated in pitch, tied to stakes in Nero's private gardens, and set ablaze at dusk. They burned slowly, their screams providing ambient horror while Rome's elite attended garden parties, their faces illuminated by the flames of dying bodies. This required logistics. Think about that for a moment. Carpenters had to build the stakes. Handlers had to manage the prisoners. Someone had to calculate the right mixture of pitch to ensure the bodies burned long enough but not too quickly. Guards coordinated the timing. Accountants tracked the costs, the quantity of pitch, the wages of executioners, the food required to keep prisoners alive until their scheduled deaths. Imperial slaves documented everything. This wasn't spontaneous violence. This was administration. Rome had built an entire infrastructure for suffering, and it ran with the efficiency of any other government program. But here's what made Nero's cruelty truly revolutionary. He turned the executions into a test of loyalty. Elite guests who attended his garden parties weren't just spectators, they were participants. Those who recoiled marked themselves as potential enemies. Those who laughed proved their allegiance. Those who admired Nero's creativity climbed the social ladder. The spectacle wasn't just punishment for the condemned, it was surveillance for everyone else. Nero's mother, Agrippina, learned this lesson fatally. She had engineered his rise to power, eliminating rivals and manipulating the succession. But when she tried to maintain control over her son, Nero demonstrated that proximity to power offered no protection. First came the collapsed ceiling fan accident that failed. Then the sabotaged boat she swam to shore. Finally, Nero abandoned subtlety and had her executed outright. The message traveled faster than any decree. If the emperor could erase the woman who made him, he could erase anyone. This is how spectacle becomes governance, not through random violence, but through carefully choreographed demonstrations that everyone sees and no one can ignore. Then came Caligula, and with him, a new innovation: cruelty as comedy. Caligula reigned from 37 to 41 CE, ascending after the slow, suffocating paranoia of Tiberius. Rome desperately wanted a ruler who felt alive, energetic, connected to the people. Caligula delivered energy, but what Rome interpreted as vitality was actually volatility. And volatility, it turns out, is far more dangerous than predictable cruelty. Because when the emperor's mood determines who lives and who dies, logic becomes meaningless. Survival becomes a dice roll. Suetonius records that Caligula would summon senators not for governance, but for humiliation. He invented treason charges on whims, insulted nobles publicly, demanded impossible vows of devotion. Trials were theater, with verdicts predetermined. The Senate wasn't a deliberative body anymore, it was an audience forced to applaud the emperor's improvisations. His dinner parties became infamous. Cassius Dio describes moments when mid-feast Caligula would signal a guard. A guest would be dragged from the table and executed in the adjacent room. The remaining diners were ordered to continue eating. Some choked on their food, others trembled, but none dared stop. Caligula watched their reactions the way a playwright studies an audience, adjusting his performance to maximize discomfort. This was surveillance disguised as festivity. Every social interaction became a potential death sentence. Trust evaporated. Romans learned to treat every invitation, every gathering, every conversation as a possible trap. In the arena, Caligula's cruelty shifted from private joke to public policy. When the games ran out of condemned criminals, when the spectacle slowed and the crowd grew restless, Caligula simply ordered entire sections of the audience thrown to the beasts. Not criminals, not prisoners, ordinary Roman citizens. Their only crime was being present when the emperor grew bored. Think about what that does to a population. Under previous emperors, you were safe if you followed the rules. Under Caligula, there were no rules. Anyone could die at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. That unpredictability was the torture. The constant grinding uncertainty that made every public appearance potentially fatal. Women of senatorial families weren't exempt. Caligula summoned them, inspected them, violated them, or paraded them as objects of scorn. Their husbands were then forced to thank the emperor for his interest. Patriarchs who once ruled households by Roman law watched their authority inverted. Their families displayed as trophies of imperial privilege. But behind the chaos lay method. Caligula's extravagant spending on games, banquets, spectacles drained the treasury rapidly. To refill it, he invented or resurrected taxes on everything. Lawsuits, marriages, prostitution, property confiscations became routine. Accusations of treason conveniently enriched the imperial coffers. Every execution created both fear and revenue. Cruelty was monetized. This is where Caligula's comedy becomes legible as statecraft. By making cruelty absurd, he destroyed the possibility of shared moral judgment. How do you protest an atrocity that the emperor presents as a joke? How do you organize resistance against a ruler who treats victims as punchlines? Caligula weaponized absurdity, and because reason couldn't contain him, no legal argument could restrain him. His erratic behavior wasn't weakness, it was armor. But unpredictability created vulnerability. When everyone is a potential target, everyone is a potential assassin. In 41 CE, members of the Praetorian Guard, senators, and palace officials concluded that survival required eliminating the source of chaos. Caligula's body was stabbed repeatedly in a palace corridor. Rome exhaled not from righteousness, but exhaustion. Yet the system that enabled him survived intact. His reign proved something foundational. Public humiliation could be as effective a tool of power as public bloodshed. Nero had taught Rome that fear could be engineered. Caligula taught Rome that fear could be performed, which brings us to Domitian and an altogether different evolution of imperial control. If Caligula mastered unpredictability, Domitian mastered silence. And silence, as Rome would learn between 81 and 96 CE, has its own brutality. Domitian distrusted spectacle. Crowds could react unpredictably with humor, mockery, or even sympathy for victims. Public violence created vulnerability. So Domitian built a different kind of terror, one that functioned best when its gears were hidden. He revived and expanded Maestas Rome's treason laws. Under earlier emperors, treason was tied to action. Plots, rebellions, conspiracies. Under Domitian, treason became atmospheric, a word spoken with the wrong tone, a hesitation in greeting the emperor, a statue of him not sufficiently honored. Even literal silence could imply dissent. But the brilliance of Domitian's system lay in its architecture. He created an ecosystem of informers delatores who prospered by accusing others. Each accusation was rewarded with money, land, or political favor. Under Nero, cruelty flowed downward from the emperor. Under Domitian, cruelty spread sideways, from citizen to citizen, until no one could tell whether their neighbor was a friend or a future accuser. Fear became decentralized, and decentralized fear is the most durable kind. The interrogation rooms are named unrecorded in official documents, but referenced again and again in ancient sources were the heart of this architecture. They weren't chambers of physical spectacle. They were chambers of psychological extraction. Domitian understood that torture didn't need an audience to be effective. Torture needed only two ingredients: secrecy and uncertainty. Senators, equestrians, nobles groups traditionally shielded from the harshest punishments found themselves dragged into these rooms. Roman law had historically limited torture, primarily to slaves. Domitian annihilated that barrier. Nobles could now be beaten, stretched, starved, burned, mutilated, not for information, but for obedience. Each scream that no one heard reinforced a political truth. The emperor had abolished the hierarchy that once protected Rome's elite. Pliny the Younger later wrote that during Domitian's reign, no man dared speak his thoughts. That sounds poetic, but it's clinical. The emperor had constructed a society where the safest political position was muteness. And when people stop speaking, they stop organizing, resisting, imagining alternatives. Domitian didn't merely punish treason, he prevented the conditions in which dissent could be born. People simply vanished. No trial, no announcement, no body. The absence itself became the message. If Nero's victims illuminated his gardens, Domitian's victims illuminated nothing. They were extinguished, and the darkness emphasized his control. By 96 CE, when palace officials with secret support from his own wife assassinated him, Rome was starving for sound. The Senate immediately condemned his memory through damnatio memoria, statues destroyed, names erased, portraits smashed. This wasn't moral cleansing. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim the public self Rome had lost in those years of whispering fear. Yet the irony is inescapable. The Senate erased Domitian's image, but preserved his system. The treason laws remained potent. The culture of accusation persisted. The idea that an emperor's power thrives in silence would echo into later reigns. And then came Commodus, who took everything his predecessors had built and inverted it completely. If Domitian hid cruelty, Commodus performed it, and he made Rome watch. Commodus, reigning from 180 to 192 CE, was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king who wrote meditations on duty and restraint. Rome hoped the son would inherit the father's wisdom. Instead, they received a ruler who believed the empire existed to validate his fantasies. Marcus Aurelius had meditated on virtue. Commodus renamed the months after himself. His favorite stage wasn't the Senate or the palace, it was the arena. And once he stepped into it, dressed as a gladiator, the hierarchy that defined Roman political life collapsed. Commodus blurred the line between emperor and entertainer, citizen and captive, life and sport. Cassius Dio records that Commodus claimed to have fought hundreds of matches. But these weren't contests. His opponents were wounded beforehand, unarmed, or explicitly ordered to submit. Some were tied to platforms, some were forced to fall theatrically. To resist was death. To perform submission was survival. He slaughtered animals with the same theatrical cruelty. On one day alone, he reportedly killed 100 lions. He decapitated ostriches and paraded with their dripping heads. He killed a giraffe, a creature no Roman had seen as dangerous simply because it made the crowd gasp. For Commodus, these killings weren't demonstrations of bravery. They were reminders that his pleasure overruled all logic. But here's what made his reign structurally significant. For the arena to become his personal playground, the bureaucracy had to provide victims, animals, armor, handlers, stage crews, guards. The state treasury funded these indulgences. The Senate couldn't object. Dissent meant death. Citizens were forced to watch, forced to cheer, forced to participate in the fiction that the emperor was a divine hero. Resistance was treason. Indifference was treason. Even fear could be treason if Commodus interpreted it as insult. He dressed as Hercules, wearing lion skins, carrying a club, demanding worship not as emperor but as demigod. Statues were recarved to resemble him. Decrees referenced him as the Roman Hercules, the empire's symbolic order. Its myths, legends, history was rewritten to fit one man's ego. This wasn't eccentricity. It was imperial rebranding through violence. By the late 180s, governance had hollowed out completely. Ministers ruled in the background while Commodus posed in the arena. Corruption flourished. Rome became a theater statutorily. The emperor's narcissistic performances replaced law, strategy, administration. His death, in 192 CE, wasn't a rebellion. It was a management decision. Members of his inner circle, his mistress, the Praetorian prefect, concluded the empire couldn't survive another year of his games. They poisoned him. When the poison failed, they sent in an athlete, the same type of performer Commodus loved to humiliate. He was strangled on the last day of the year. The Senate's reaction was instantaneous relief. They declared him a public enemy, erased his name, restored the months. Statues were smashed, inscriptions rewritten. But erasing his image didn't erase his lesson, because after Commodus fell, Rome faced a question it could no longer dodge. Had torture become the empire's identity rather than its tool? For emperors, for styles, one truth. Nero weaponized spectacle. Caligula weaponized mockery. Domitian weaponized silence. Commodus weaponized self-worship. But together, they did something far more lasting than any individual reign. They transformed cruelty from aberration into institution, from emergency measure into standard procedure, from the exception into the rule. The machinery they built, the arena economy, the informer networks, the interrogation protocols, the property seizure systems didn't die with them. It adapted, it became bureaucracy. And bureaucracy, once established, doesn't require cruel emperors to function cruelly. It just requires momentum. Rome survived these men, but it survived as something different, harder, quieter, more frightened. The population had learned to expect cruelty, tolerate it, live within it. The Senate had learned that obedience was safer than principle. The military had learned that loyalty was transactional. The legal system had learned that conviction was more important than justice. And perhaps most tragically, Rome had learned that pain could be profitable. Every execution generated revenue through property confiscation. Every arena spectacle stimulated commercial ecosystems. Every treason trial created opportunities for informers. Cruelty wasn't just governance, it was industry. By the 3rd century, when Rome faced genuine existential threats, barbarian invasions, economic collapse, military fragmentation, the empire discovered it had spent a century building the wrong kind of strength. It had muscles for inflicting suffering, but no muscles for inspiring loyalty. It had systems for manufacturing fear, but no systems for generating hope. You can rule through terror for decades, even centuries, but you cannot build a future on it, because terror teaches people to survive, not to believe. And an empire where no one believes in the laws, in the institutions, in the meaning of citizenship itself, is already ruins. It just hasn't fallen yet. The bones that archaeologists unearth from mass graves outside Rome, the skeletal remains showing signs of torture. The crosses that line the Appian Ways aren't anomalies. They're the foundation. The marble was beautiful. The aqueducts were brilliant. The roads were eternal. But underneath it all, Rome was built on a simple, terrible philosophy. Power is the capacity to inflict pain without consequence. And once a civilization accepts that philosophy, once it becomes embedded in law and custom and public expectation, it doesn't matter how many tyrants you assassinate. The system remains, the bones remain, and they still speak.